So this is what we have as the agenda as far as the webinar is concerned. So just focusing on pipeline, how do you forecast for the types of resources that you need, and how to focus on that demand planning. And we'll kind of cross over into the capacity session that we did last week, so you can see how they match up in general. So I define demand as the staff that's needed to deliver the services that you've sold or that you're expected to sell, which is slightly different than capacity, because capacity is the staff you have available to deliver the services. So this is where we're getting into how are we tracking what is coming or what we have sold and what kind of backlog. So the things that you've sold are backlog, and the things you're expected to sell are pipeline. So a lot of you already know this from a forecasting perspective, where you can do forecasting and early planning in OpenAir with pipeline activities, and definitely track what has been sold as you deliver projects so that you can call off the backlog that you have. And really, the ability to understand the demand is almost directly related to the way that you're forecasting the type of work that needs to be delivered, the backlog of work that you've sold and the pipeline of work that you're expecting to sell. How are you tracking what's coming in and what's been sold from a project perspective, from a type of resource perspective? Those forecasting approaches have a direct relationship to how can you report on demand out of OpenAir. Now, pipeline, you can look at it three ways if you want to forecast it for resources needs. And this is the same as the capacity pieces. Like I need to be able to forecast that I need certain headcount to deliver the work that I've sold or expected to sell. Or I can think of it in terms of hours, like how many hours of a resource do I need to be able to deliver the work that I've sold or I'm expecting to sell. And then finally, money, and this is where I usually see pipeline is it's all about money, the value of a deal, because that's typically like a sales target or a revenue target for the organization. So the pipeline directly translates into money. But you can look at pipeline in those hours and FTE views as well, because that's how you're going to be able to understand the demand. Selling things from a money perspective, of course, is how you're going to make money as a company, but you do need to understand the resources and how you're delivering those resources, how those resources can deliver that work to be able to attain that money. So the FTE and the hours are what we're going to focus on first, on how can you plan out the demand of the resource types that you are seeing based on the work that's coming in. So full-time equivalent, or FTE, is based on the fact that you need a certain number of people based on like a full-time schedule. So for the U.S., it's like a 40-hour work week. For other countries, it could be less or more. And there's standard reporting values. I mentioned this in last week's webinar about the standard FTE reporting values, like booked FTE, assigned FTE. And those actually apply from a forecasting or a demand perspective, because they're available for your resources that you have scheduled out, and they're also available for generics. And generics are a type of person in the system. So that's what we're going to focus on next, is really what a generic is. The screenshot that I have here in this webinar is actually the planner view of the tool. If you haven't seen or haven't been using that yet, the planner is a nice way to view information graphically very quickly, and you can see all the different projects that people are scheduled on if you do some sorting, and you can see the roll-up. So here with this generic I called NetSuite OpenAir Consultant, you can see that starting in the October-November time frame, I need 330% of a person, or 3.3 FTEs, 3.2 FTEs, 3.6, and so forth. So you can actually use the scheduling actions in OpenAir to schedule out an expectation of the types of resources that you need and schedule out the hours that they need to deliver. And those can be rolled up to understand your FTE simply by using what's called a generic in the system, if you don't happen to know the name of the person who will do the work. So generics really are very useful tools in OpenAir. If you're not leveraging generics, they're basically a user in the system, but they don't use a license, and you can't log in as a generic. They're really a placeholder person. And they have all the same features and aspects of a user record as a user account in the system. So if you've set up entity tags on your users, the generics can also have entity tags. If you have job codes, the generics can have a job code. They have a schedule that they're associated with them. If you have custom fields on the user record, they're also available on the generic. And really anything that you can report on, basically from a user perspective, you can actually substitute a generic for that. But the fact that generics don't use a license means you can go a little bit crazy if you want on the generics to represent all the different types of resources that you want. And quite often what I see at a minimum is a generic is defined for each one of the job codes that you may have in the company. So project manager, a technical consultant, a trainer, those job codes or categories that you give people, they tend to drive the definition, or at least the initial definition, of a generic. Where I've seen this get expanded quite nicely is where you want to start crossing into, not only do I need a project manager, I need a subject matter expert project manager for the energy industry, or a creative director, or something that's a little bit more refined from the general title. And that's where you can start introducing any number of generics to represent a role, an industry, and even a skill set. So you could say I need a Java developer with expertise in web design. You probably don't want to go that detailed, but to say you need a Java developer versus a developer is a nice refinement, because that gives your resource management and your scheduling folks some indication of the type of skill that you need. And since the generics can actually have a skill profile, they can use entity tags, they can have custom fields on it, it makes the generics one of the main areas that we want to focus in on from a demand perspective, because the generics can start representing the demand, the type of demand, and being able to run those reports with those FTE numbers. We can do a user FTE or a job code FTE and start coming up with a list of the demand based on the generics that have been defined in the system. So you don't always have to use your named resources. You can use a generic and get a report like this, where we're doing a forecast based on the scheduling of information using generics, and the generics have a certain job code or job category like consultant or management, and that forecast out can indicate the number of headcount that we need to deliver that work, and that generic can to deliver against this type of number. So generics are actually a key part of understanding the demand planning. You don't have to use just your resources. You can use these generics and leverage the fact that they're really the type of resource that you need to deliver the work, and that will drive a lot of the reporting that you can meet in the demand planning. Now, the example I have on the screen is the same one that I used for capacity, because I wanted to kind of show you how you can compare and contrast things in the system. This particular report, it's a booked FTE report, so the reporting value in October, November, and December are the booked full-time equivalents of resources I need to deliver the work in each of the job code categories. But you'll notice that on the job code, I do have an actual count of the quantity on staff. So this quantity on staff is coming from actual user accounts, not generics, but actual user accounts. And the October through November and December is a combination of individual users that are pre-scheduled and generics. So you get sort of a combination view of total demand when you're dealing with the booked FTE, for example. But the job code value, this is what you have on staff. So that's how you get that compare of capacity versus demand from a full-time equivalent, because the system will natively bring that in, and the generics help fill out the expectation of additional work coming in. Now, from an hours perspective, it's very similar. So using the generics, you're scheduling people from an hours perspective, those hours turn into FTE as you saw on the report. But there's a couple of values that to be aware of for scheduling. So there's assigned hours and booked hours, and those reporting values are really dependent on how you're scheduling in OpenAir. So if you're doing task assignments as your schedule, you'll use assigned hours. If you're using the bookings in the resources module, you'll use booked hours. But there's another version of these reporting values called with actuals. So there's assigned hours with actuals, there's booked hours with actuals. And what these reporting values do is they actually, I like to use them when I'm looking at things like EAC, estimate at completion, because what happens is when you use the with actuals reporting value, when you put that value on the report, it will pull actual time data from today backwards, and it will pull your scheduling information from tomorrow forward. So if I'm running the report today, it will look backwards from October 18th for actual time in the system, and then it will look forward from October 19th forward to pull the booked hours. And the combination of the two is a refined plan of how much time I expect to spend on a project or a task or something. Now the interesting thing is these reporting values are user-based, right? So the people that are scheduled. But if you use a generic can never have actual time. It's not a real person. It's not a real account. So if you use these with actual values, there are no actuals. So it will actually ignore all historical values and simply give you future schedule altogether. And the example that I have on the screen here, I've run this for October, and you can see all the booked hours for the total month is 435. But booked hours with actuals, because I ran it today on the 18th, it's coming up with 290.4 because there has been no time for that generic historically for October before 18th because the generic can't have actual time. So it's a nice little way to see where the forecast is only and being able to see the true picture from today forward if you want by using these with actuals values. But really the forecasting of demand quite often falls into a money category. So scheduling is a great way to understand the demand. Scheduling with the generics gives you that layer of skill and type of resource that you need. But the third way of forecasting, of course, is money. And a lot of times when you say pipeline forecasting, you're really talking about money. And you're not necessarily talking about like headcount or hours. Now, the money can be forecasted one of two ways. And how money factors into demand planning is typically when you have people on staff, you're expecting some kind of revenue target per person. Or when you're doing your budget to figure out your revenue targets for the year, there's an expectation of how many hours they'll be billable and what's their average bill rate, which translates into how much revenue could this person generate, which is the money capacity reporting value. So from a demand perspective, you can still run a forecast with money and have it translate into number of headcount because you have an expectation of how much money each person should earn for the company. So if I expect to earn $1 million for the year and each person can do $200,000, I better hire 5 people, or at least have 5 people with no cushion at all. And the forecasting capability in OpenAir, actually there's 2 ways to do forecasting. One is called charge projections, and that's really going to look at how have you scheduled people and set milestone dates to be able to forecast those hours becoming money in the situation of time billing or milestones being met in the situation of 6B. And the other type is called straight-line forecasting. This is where you don't really have a lot of information to be able to do the forecast. You just know approximately a time frame and an approximate value of the engagement. So it tends to be a very high-level introductory forecast when you know the basics of what you're selling. If we're deploying OpenAir, I would put probably 6 months and spread the value of the contract over those 6 months, and that would be my initial forecast from a money perspective. Okay. Both of these forecasting methods use what's called projected reporting values, and anything with the word projected and rules that are in brackets, these are part of the charge projection or the forecasting feature in OpenAir. So that's, I'm going to show you the charge projection feature, but you could do projected billing and revenue and cost and even revenue margin. These all are values that get computed on a regular basis in OpenAir to do a forecast of money. So if you do your forecast of money, then you'll be able to forecast your revenue targets, and the revenue targets then can be laid up against the capacity that you've computed based on how many hours you expect people to deliver and what's the average bill rate that each type of person could do that. And we covered that in the capacity session last week. So if you combine those together, you can very easily have reports or graphs like this that show you, okay, so the green bar is the total capacity for delivery. So based on this, it looks like by the end of the year I could achieve a 2.3, maybe $2.2 million delivery of capacity, but the revenue target for the company is 2.9 or 2.8. So obviously I have a staffing gap just to be able to reach that unless people work really long hours. So I would be looking to hire and understanding how early does the gap become unmanageable for the current team to support it, and if I need to hire somebody by June to be productive and close this gap, how far backwards does that hiring person need to onboard so that I give them time to ramp up to be able to be productive and close this forecast gap that I have. So capacity and demand can be put together on graphs and give you an idea of what your staffing plan should be, your timing of when you should hire staff to be able to deliver that money from a forecasting perspective. Now, if you haven't actually looked at or know about the charge projections feature, this is how forecasting is done in OpenAir. So it's part of the project settings. So if you go to administration, I'll show you in the system here. If you go to administration, project settings, there's things called charge projections. And the charge projections basically give you a way to know, first off, how recently has this run? And typically the charge projections is something that's scheduled to run on a batch perspective. There's a schedule action down here, and it's usually run every night for most companies. So every night it refreshes, and it can be run on demand. And what it'll do is it'll take the controls that you've set up based on what defines forecast work. So worked and booked in this example is what's set up, which means it'll pull time data. And if time data is not there, it's going to pull bookings in the system, booked hours. And that's how this forecast is going to get computed. And then you also tell it a time frame. So it's starting from this month forward. So it always starts with October 1, and it goes forward for 365 days or a year in the system. And there's been recent enhancements to the system to be able to filter out certain stages or exclude inactive projects to help with performance for those companies who have a large volume of information in the system. But this charge projections feature is what gets computed nightly and gets translated into these reporting values here, these projected reporting values. So based on how you do your scheduling, you can get that forecast revenue in the system and understand keep it current by having it run on a nightly basis. Now, as you factor in, if you think about the controls that we have for charge projections with the approved and booked or the worked and booked hours, when you're scheduling generics, anything that has actuals doesn't apply. So approved, if you're forecasting just approved hours or worked hours, then the generics would do nothing for you. If you're forecasting with approved and booked or worked and booked, those others, it's sort of the same as the with actuals reporting value. Generics don't have any actuals, so you'll always get a forecast from the today forward based on the forecasting calculations for generics, because generics don't have any actuals historically in the system. So that's the revenue piece or the billing piece of it that you're using that relies on the resource schedule. But there is another aspect to the scheduling, and this is called Straightline billing projections. What Straightline billing projections support is that high level, I don't know who's going to do this work. I don't know the number of people that I need or the number of hours, but I have an approximate idea of the deal size that I'm selling and the time frame that I would deliver it. So a Straightline billing projections feature in OpenAir, you can put a start date and an end date on a project and give it a budget, and it will take that budget and it'll spread it across that time frame. And I say it'll spread it across evenly, but actually what OpenAir does is it takes that value, that 100K in this example, and it actually breaks it down so it figures out the value per day. So certain months have more days than other months, so you'll see that your forecast is not, in this example, 25K every month over 4 months. It's going to slightly change based on the number of working days in the month, because OpenAir is going to break it all the way down to a day level and then roll it up on a monthly level. So that's how the Straightline billing projections work. And for companies who maybe haven't adopted resource scheduling yet in OpenAir, Straightline billing projections is still available because it doesn't rely on resource scheduling. And it's a nice initial way to do forecasting because you still get some kind of money value and you have an expectation of the delivery aspect of your capacity, so you can actually still do the basic forecasting and figure out your demand based on just the forecast capabilities of Straightline billing projections. So a little bit more information about the Straightline billing projections. So this is actually one of those features, I like to call it the Easter egg feature, because if you set up a custom field with a certain naming convention, it unlocks this functionality. So you have to create a custom checkbox called Straightline billing projections, exactly this wording with the capitalization and underscores and everything. And that is a checkbox that is associated with a project stage. When you have that checkbox set up, you go into the project stages, and for each stage that you want to respect Straightline billing projections, you check the box. And that stage, all projects in that stage will forecast a Straightline billing forecast. So it'll ignore the rules. If you have billing rules in the system, it'll ignore the rules. It'll ignore resource schedule. It'll just forecast Straightline. So quite often the approach here is that you set up a single stage for your early planning, your early pipeline tracking to do Straightline billing projections, and then the other stages may rely on the rules and do the normal charge projection function. Okay. With the Straightline billing, you have to give it a start and an end date for it to be able to spread the time frame. So the start date on the project is by default the start date that's used in this feature. And the end date is something that you can either let the system compute, or you can actually set up another custom date field called project end date, exactly like this on the project, and set a date in there. The calculated end date is something like if you're doing your tasks and your planned hours and you're assigning people and you're putting dates on your tasks, that calculated finish date is what OpenAir would use for your Straightline billing projections. So if you're doing assigned hours as your assignments as your schedule, then your Straightline billing projections would use the end date that you're doing for your schedule. But quite often I'll have customers set up the project end date field so they have more control over the start and end date for the Straightline billing projection. So to see this in the system, if you went to the administration module in the project settings and you go to project stages, so in this particular system we have the proposal stage set up, and the proposal stage has this checkbox here for Straightline billing projection. So this is a custom field, it's a checkbox, and that's that naming convention. So this is checked, which means it's going to forecast from a Straightline perspective for demand. And the more refined you have on your generic names, the more information you can get from a skill need perspective, like what kinds of skills. Like I said, the generics actually can have a skill profile. They can have entity tags. They can have custom fields. They have job codes. So if you name your generics in a way that you can see I need 7 Java developers and 3 web UX designers, those would be ways that you could see the FTEs that you need or the demand you need by the different skills in the system. And likewise, if you need to understand like the type of product, so if you're doing a product install versus a technical training, if you tagged your projects in a way to understand whether it's training or deployments or business efficiencies like we do, then you'd be able to understand the skill sets that are needed to deliver that, and then you'd be able to use your skill set FTE report based on job codes or generics to understand if you have the right people on staff to support that. So another capacity versus demand kind of view in the system. So basically, demand is something that can be measured in different ways. It's still the number of people that you need, but you can look at it as headcount, you can look at it as hours, you can have it be factored into the way that you're doing revenue forecasting in the system. And all 3 of those are valid. It really depends on what's going to be the most accurate way for you to get not only how many people you need, but what kind of people you need. And that's where we come up with those things like generics and entity tags to do that grouping so that you can see things at a more refined level. I do encourage, as you're setting up demand reports and forecast reports, that you consider putting reports together that show capacity versus demand, like that graph that has the capacity versus demand I showed here, or even that FTE report where I have quantity on staff versus what I've scheduled out, because that gives you a better view at a point in time and as a forecast perspective to see when will you start falling short on headcount availability and when would you need to start hiring so that you can get that person in and productive as soon as possible in the system.